Got my coffee and today's guest here with me, so we're ready to roll. I'm Michael Hanf, Executive Partner at Taiwan Advisory. Welcome to our Circular Coffee Break podcast, where we will be casually talking about everything circular and beyond. Now, we hope the podcast is interesting, insightful, and provides you new perspectives. But if you have any feedback, improvement ideas, or suggestions, let us know, either by leaving a comment on your favorite podcasting platform or by dropping us a note at info@taiwan.com. Now, my guest today is at the heart of the energy transition. He started his career in defense at BAE Systems, where, among other things, he was involved in the Eurofighter program management. From there, he moved to Accenture, where he spent 16 years in strategy and transformation roles, e.g. as managing director for digital strategy and ventures. Since 2020, he's the founder and CEO of Drift Energy, which, as mentioned, is at the heart of the energy transition. And we will for sure be talking about that in today's conversation. He holds a master in engineering and systems engineering from the Loughborough University, as I was told it's pronounced. I hope I didn't butcher it too badly. I'm really excited to talk about the green energy transition in today's episode. Thanks for joining me on the show, Ben Medland.
Thank you, Michael. Wonderful to be here. And yes, I've got my coffee too.
Perfect. I hope I didn't mess up the university name too badly. I tried to, at least I tried. So
it was very good. This is a tough one. Loughborough University, you did nail it.
Yeah, I mean, from the spelling, I would have not guessed it. But, you always learn something new. To get us started, could you maybe introduce Drift and how it is basically connected to the green energy transition and how you got started?
Sure, thank you. So I guess we'll start with the energy transition link, right, which is, I think it would probably be something that we would agree on, most of your listeners will probably agree on, right, which is the world needs more energy, right? But it also needs it to be greener, and it also needs it fast. And when you look at the energy transition, climate change, the impacts, one can make a very strong argument for we're not going fast enough. And so our logic is, well, if things are taking too long and are too slow, all renewables are good in our eyes, but if they're taking a while, they're constrained and you can't deploy them over, you can't scale them out as quickly as you need to, then the best form of logic in that would be to add another way. And so that's what Drift is to add a new pathway along the transition to, along the energy transition to net zero. The way we do that, I'll explain that very briefly, and actually just help your listeners through a little bit of logic here, which is, so we're talking about the energy transition, greener energy. Well, where is the vast majority of the world's renewable energy? Do you want to have a guess?
I would argue in the sun or the oceans. So they're big enough. So,
and that's exactly it. The answer is the oceans, right? And really, what this is that if you look at an energy map of the world, you traditionally look at it through the lens of heat mapping where the energy potential is on land, right? We see a lot of classical graphs that show, lots of solar potential across, the Middle East, desert areas, etc. A lot of wind energy in Chile, etc. But actually, a lot of those graphs and images just ignore the ocean. When you actually color in the ocean, that's where the vast majority of the renewable energy is, both solar, wind, and the other forms of oceanic energy. So with that in mind, then the question becomes, well, then how do we tap into that? Because traditional renewables can't reach across the 70% of the world that we call the ocean. And by the way, that's another part of Drift, which is when you look at the inverse map of the world and look at the ocean like land, then you realize there's a lot of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you access it? And well, that's where Drift comes in. So we are creating Drift Energy yachts. The way you can think about this is it's a flotilla of sailboats that sail over the horizon to basically regenerate green hydrogen by splitting seawater, and then using an AI routing algorithm to keep them in Goldilocks conditions, and then deliver that energy back to any port in the world. And when you do that, you effectively, our soundbite is, you end up with what we call free-range wind farms with planet-scale impact. And so that's Drift. That's our contributions to add another wave that can scale across 70% of the globe.
Cool, perfect. Thanks for that. And I mean, hydrogen, specifically green hydrogen, is a huge topic in the energy industry, and way beyond that. Actually, if you think about the different ways energy is being consumed or used, hydrogen is one of the big bets of the future. So being able to produce that, as you said, in a huge area like the oceans is naturally providing a great alternative to the on-land, limited on-land possibilities that we're still seeing. Now, you started Drift in 2020. How has the energy market changed from your point of view since then, both in the area you're working in, but also more broadly? And how has it basically been providing opportunities, but also challenges from your point of view?
Yeah, well, since then, we've had quite a few things change. The energy market, as I'm sure your listeners are very well aware, has been in a bit of a turmoil over the last couple of years. Sadly to say, things like the Ukraine crisis, the energy shock that threw through the energy sector, renewable energy generation, the pressure on governments to increase their or to reduce their carbon intensity, to invest heavier into renewable technologies. We're seeing fusion, leaps forward in fusion energy. We're seeing leaps into what might have been challenged maybe 5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, pre-Ukraine, around developing more oil and gas installations. So there's been a huge amount of change because of that kind of shock to the system. But if I double click a little bit into, say, hydrogen, for instance, I think the thing there is you kind of look at it from just simply a word search, right? Which is that maybe 3 years ago, if you tried to run like a hydrogen search, you might find a few things, right?
Yeah.
You might even find a couple of conferences and go and hang out with maybe 50 to 100 odd people. Now hydrogen is the thing. It's in the energy sector. A lot of people are setting up conferences specifically dedicated to hydrogen. It's becoming part of the sort of general vernacular of the population. People are starting to ask questions about it. To give you an example, we turned up at a hydrogen conference in Wales just a couple of weeks ago, and there were 600 people there. Right, and that I think speaks to where the traction's going. But I think it also speaks to, as you say, this sort of future fuels strategy, which is we often get questions of, well, why would you do what you're doing with Drift? Why don't you just build a wind turbine? And our response is that the energy transition isn't a silver bullet problem, right? It's I think the I can't remember who it was, but at the World Economic Forum, someone described it more as a silver buckshot problem, right? We need a lot of bets, and it's called an energy mix for a reason. So will hydrogen be the silver bullet? No, not in all cases, and not in every location for every user. But it is a huge marketplace that needs to scale out. To give you an example, is it a $10 trillion business? I think Goldman Sachs were listing hydrogen to be in, say, 2050. We're starting at such a small scale at the moment in terms of the actual electrolysis and green hydrogen production. And that's before you get into blue production and other forms of hydrogen production. So there's a huge amount of scaling that needs to happen. I think that's what's really exciting is we're starting our company in that space where the entire industry is starting at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you've seen in the number of conferences, as you said, and participants, what you've also seen in my view, at least, is a shift from a scientific view more towards a business and use case driven view. So a couple of years ago, it was scientific. It was scientists look into hydrogen and how it works and how it could bring solutions. Nowadays, it's more business driven. It's more use case driven, which creates a whole different new set of challenges in the whole setup. But as you said, I think it's not one solution. It's a very broad set of solutions. How do you?
I think there's also something in there about the thing I've seen as well is investment and government policy around the world. So again, if you wind the clock back pre-2020 and pre Drift's inception, there are a handful of countries with stated hydrogen ambitions, and now you see so many more countries applying themselves to this is our ambition for hydrogen. The European strategy came out, I think, mid-2020. I think in mid-21, it was the UK published its first hydrogen strategy. So you're starting to see, and then you have the Inflation Reduction Act. That's driving an awful lot more interest and unlocking a lot more of this investment capital. I think the other thing I've seen is that on the investment side, which has been very interesting to watch, is that money has flowed easier, let's say, to the demand side of, say, a hydrogen market. Yeah, there's people that produce hydrogen and there's people that need it and use it. And money seems to have flowed quickly to those companies on the demand side, from my observations at least. Because, well, if you've got a hydrogen car or a bus or a train, you can basically sell that product and start making revenue back from it immediately. But a hydrogen production facility is a 20-year asset, and it requires a lot of upfront capital. Money has flowed less quickly to that side of the market, and I think we're certainly seeing in the UK market there's such an insatiable amount of demand for hydrogen. There's no hydrogen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see that in a lot of areas. I mean, if you look at e-mobility as a whole, I mean, a lot of investments have been given into electric cars, electric vehicles. Not that much has been floating so far into the infrastructure, which is why we now have to play catch up and make sure the infrastructure is there for all the electric cars that are being sold. And the same is then true in this space as well. Now, in order to basically make the green energy transition happen, there's a lot of different players. You spoke now about investors, but there's the regulator, which you also touched upon. There's the consumers and all of these players. How do you see the different stakeholders playing together to basically provide the frame that companies like Drift, but also other companies, can be successful in providing one of the silver bullets that can contribute to making that transition happen?
It's a fun question, that one, because when you look at what we're doing with, let's just keep it on the hydrogen transition. I'll park for the moment that there's also ammonia, like green ammonia, green methanol, e-fuels, electrification, and all the challenges that all of those will face. They all face the same challenge in the hydrogen space, which is you need a source of circular feedstock, right? In the case of green hydrogen, that's electricity, green electricity. Then you need to have an electrolysis unit to split, a production facility to create that element, that fuel. Then you need to compress it, store it, move it, and distribute it. And then you need to vend it and use it. And there's so many different ways that you can do those things. Are you storing it as compressed? Are you liquefying it? Are you turning it into a vector such as green ammonia and moving it around the world and then cracking it back? There's so many options on that pathway that it is quite difficult to lay out exactly where this is all going to land. And that's the same as when you start to look across to electrification, or whether it's ammonia production as well. So because there's that sort of myriad of ways that this jigsaw puzzle could be put together, it becomes quite a fun challenge to think through and how to scale. A footnote on Drift, one of the reasons that we're progressing with our technology and why when we talk to governments and particularly small island nations is that actually we condense a number of those value chain steps into one single integrated mobile asset. And it's called a ship, right? So we have the energy production, we have the electrolysis, we have the storage, the compression, and because it's on a mobile asset, the distribution. So by condensing all of that down together, you get the sort of interesting benefit of a flexible and mobile energy source, which we're the first ever mobile class of renewable energy is another way of phrasing it. But your point about, you're asking the question of like how does all of this infrastructure play together? How can we make some lessons learned? I think if I repeat back what I'm hearing from different hydrogen companies and conferences, more investment in technology for storage, right? Storage tech in hydrogen is a big investment area. I think the other element is less around electrolysis. This is always good to improve the rate, the efficiency of electrolysis, the cost reduction, the feedstock. Like, does it have to be ultra pure water, or could it be seawater? Could it be potable water? How do we improve the efficiency of electrolysis? This is a good area of research. But then I think it just comes down to it's about if the use cases and matching up projects to use cases, because this is very much like the early days of any marketplace, whether that be Uber or Airbnb. We need to gear better demand and supply. And currently at the moment, there seems to be, like I said, quite a lot of excitement around the demand side of the marketplace, but less joining up of the supply side. And that is where I think government, policymakers and organizations and industry can focus on, is how to promote those use cases and plug things together.
Interesting. And I mean, one component, and that's where Drift naturally contributes as well, is the decentralized nature of energy production. So earlier you had these huge plants that were in one place, and then you distributed the energy from there. If you basically have one of your energy producers sail around the world, you basically need to have a very different logistics approach, understanding of the decentralized nature of that. How well do you think the industry is equipped, or is basically developing paths towards this much more decentralized? Because it's the same in solar, it's the same in many other areas where it will be much more decentralized than the old model of energy in that case. Is that something that you see develop? Is that something where you say, like, well, not a problem? Where do you see that playing?
I mean, decentralized energy is basically what Drift is, right? So we're pushing hard into that space. And you raise an interesting point, which is when I talked about that value chain of hydrogen, and again, just sticking with hydrogen, it's slowed up by the weakest link in the chain. And again, I can't speak for Europe, but certainly for the UK, one of the weak parts of the chain is it's the grid. Right? So if you want to connect an electrolysis plant to the grid right now, you have to be very selective of where you're going to place that, because the grid may not be able to actually feed you the connection. So it takes years to get these connections set up and established through the national grid. And that's before you start thinking about planning permission for building wind turbines or solar parks and doing all that sort of stuff. The grid is a constraint on that deployment. So when you get to a distributed energy like Drift, and again, the beauty of it being a ship is you can make as many as you want and deploy as many as you want, right? Again, there's no land use problem. That you're not waiting for planning permission. You're not waiting to lay a big cable under the ocean. You're building ships and they can go out to sea, and there's a lot of sea, as we've described earlier on the call. I think we did the maths of something like we could have over 1 million Drift vessels and still have like the area of France around each one, like something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
So it might be my math might be a little bit suspect in that space, but it's a lot of space, right? There's a lot of ocean. So we represent that opportunity to actually go decentralized, but also be able to do it quicker, right? Because we can deploy vessels without that constraint. I think the other part of this is when you get to distributed assets like this, you're helping a very interesting part of the market. And our strategy from from a global impact perspective is to really target the fringes of the energy transition that are being left behind. So, the challenge and the opportunity here is, well, the challenge is that small island nations, they're at the front line of climate change, right? Some islands might not be there post climate change. And even if they do remain, their ecology, their economics will change because of the nature of the warming oceans and rising sea levels. And right now, our studies and looking into the energy needs of those nations, they're struggling to go to renewables, right? They're not able to deploy the traditional renewable techniques because they're either land intensive or they use the ocean or they get in the way of tourism. Or they're in particularly difficult geographies where getting the materials and so forth to those locations is very challenging. And they actually pay more for their energy because they're at the bottom of the energy food chain, right? They're behind all of the nations around the globe that are struggling to buy up energy post-Ukraine. So we actually think targeting, as part of our plan, is to target the small island nations with a story that says, well, if you already bring in 98% of your energy on a ship in the form of diesel oil, well, then just change the ship, right? And actually, you can go from being, with a decentralized asset like Drift, you can go from being energy dependent to being energy secure. But then one step further, that is actually you can start exporting energy. And this is where I think the small island nations have not just an opportunity for energy, but an opportunity for economic growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're making a brilliant point there. I mean, the change that we're seeing in the quantity of climate change and all of these other things that are currently hitting us, they're leaving a lot of nations behind that either cannot afford the change or are just left out otherwise. So by giving them the possibility with Drift and other technologies to maybe even jump over some of these development steps. But what we've seen in Africa with banking is that African countries, African consumers jumped over a lot of the development steps we had, let's say, in other countries, like with bank branches and with internet and all of that. They went directly to mobile phones because that was the easiest way for them. And with that, they were able to really accelerate the development. It would be great to see something similar in that space where a player like Drift can actually enable these island nations that otherwise would be left out to really tie into that green energy transition and become a provider instead of basically a beggar for green energy from industry countries in that context. How do you see, because there's a lot of discussions currently in very many different places of the world with very high shot politicians and business people around how this transition needs to go, and also how the split between the north and the south and the different parts of the world is going. How do you see the chance, but also the challenges for Drift to address exactly what you just said, to provide these island nations with these alternatives and basically enable them to jump this development chain and become an energy provider?
Well, there's a Drift challenge, which is we need to get to one. Right, as you mentioned in the intro, we are a startup, and we we have only been going a couple of years. So we're looking to get to our first, what we call minimum viable yacht, which would be a 1 megawatt electrolysis plant on basically driven by sail power. So getting to one is a big challenge. But everything we're talking about with Drift is a mosaic of proven parts, right? It all exists. And specialty ships have been designed and built and manufactured. They're rolling off the production lines as we speak for things like liquefied natural gas, oil, wind farm building, etc. So it's all doable. We need to get to one. But then the real challenge is how do we help the energy transition at scale? Well, then it becomes a different challenge. It's not about getting to one, it's about getting to many, and cheaply and quickly. And that's the same challenge that wind energy has faced, which is, I think it was 2000 in the UK, don't hold me to it, but I think it was around 2000 in the UK when we put our first ever wind turbines offshore. And you can see what's happened in the last 2 decades in terms of that technology. We need to achieve the same with drift, because if we can do that, then we can really move the needle on small island nations, who, by the way, because of the nature of their energy mix, it emits, sad to say, twice the CO2 per capita of non-island nations. So the challenge there is that really then just a case of the normal kind of infrastructure challenge, which is how do you build a factory that can produce drift vessels quickly? How can you service those vessels? How can you operate them? And how can you do it in such a way that's infrastructure light? Because again, small island nations, short on space. Thankfully, when it comes to hydrogen supply chain for things like fuel cell to grid, we're talking ISO containers, not huge massive plants. We're talking footprints, car park sized footprints for energy. So I think those are the challenges in terms of scaling our company. I think the challenge for island nations that we're looking to help them with is how do you do that without having to make one monolithic huge bet, right? Because again, another benefit of drift is you can get into this on smaller scales, so you can bite it off, right? And it will fit with other solutions at the same time. So it's a complementary process. And that's, I think, for small island nations, it's, again, helping them with a multi, with an energy mix, right? Not a single solution, an energy mix. And how do you integrate that so that it works out for the benefit and equity of the people in that community? How do you make it cheaper? How do you make it sustainable? How do you create jobs in those areas? We very much believe that through drift, we can stimulate the economy of countries through job creation, through upskilling, through maintenance, servicing, etc. I think those are real positive to the economy of what you'd call the blue economy.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can easily see quite a few positive impacts that you would have in that context. Lower cost, but at the same time bringing energy to parts of the world where energy is scarce, where energy is expensive, where energy is not an everyday thing. I fully agree. So related to that. What do you see as some of the main challenges and opportunities? I mean, you pointed out in your last answer, but also earlier, some of them already. But if you look at the energy sector as a whole today, and you would basically kind of have a magic wand, and you would say like, okay, these are the challenges that I will make go away, and these are the opportunities I will basically magnify. What are some of the things you're looking at, both for drift, but also on a broader scale?
Well, I feel like I might begin to the point where I'll speak less about drift because maybe your listeners are now starting to hear more of a sales talk than a perspective. If I keep it macro, what do I think is the main challenge here? I think if I was to really press it, I would say that I think at the time when our world needs it the most to accelerate the energy transition, the sad truth is that the world's distracted, right? We've had a pandemic. We're working through the ramifications of a war in Europe. We're working through a process of we're seeing the slowdown of globalization, and certainly lots of arguments towards localization of demand and in economies and pulling things back onshore. We're seeing interest rates rising and inflation hitting. And what that's done, if you simply look at venture capital and private equity deployments, and again, research your own statistics, but what we're seeing is over half of the whatever the deployments are in the first quarter of this year is half of what it was last year. Right. Now, a lot of commentators will say that won't continue. There's dry powder, lots of it ready to deploy. There's government policy that's backing things, etc. But I feel like that's the biggest challenge to the energy transition. And what I really hope I'm not explaining to my son when I'm retired is that the reason the world didn't stop warming up, or the reason it's warmed up to where it might end up, isn't because we just got distracted by that financial aspect of, okay, there's a war, there's global geopolitics moving around, and it's now costing too much to invest in this long-term infrastructure. We can't raise the debt against these assets. I really hope that's not the reason that the world warms up.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely with you on that, and I fully agree. I think currently it feels there's so many things that are requiring focus that there's not really focus on any of them, to be honest. And we see a lot of this also in the political spectrum happening at the moment, where things are prioritized that one or the other of us would maybe not prioritize in the current situation. But
now, and I don't want that to sound negative in the sense that, it's all doom and gloom, because it's definitely not, right? There's so many wonderful organizations, government policies, the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, that's stimulated it to such an extent now that actually the attraction of talent and I'm seriously considering, where does Drift grow up as a company, right? Because we're based in the UK, but if the incentive is in America and the exposure to an American market through the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, it makes you think about the geopolitics of energy and where energy companies want to locate themselves. So there's definitely lots of reasons to be positive, and that's my natural mode of operations, to be positive. I just really hope that we can overcome these sort of challenges currently to maintain focus on what is a 20-30 year problem.
No, absolutely. And we have been working in this space now for the past 6-7 years. And I think there has never been in that time as much focus, as much acceleration on the topics of climate change, CO2 emissions, biodiversity loss, and all of these topics as we have today. Now, you can always argue, is it fast enough? Is it the right focus? Are we distracted by other things? Absolutely. But I think we see acceleration, we see focus on these topics. Now, let's maybe move back to Drift for a moment. I mean, looking ahead, what's in the future for Drift? What are the next steps that you basically see towards this unit of one, MVP, then scaling, then going beyond that? What is the future looking like?
Yeah, it's very exciting. I have to say that. So, I would have to say that because I'm super positive about what we're doing as a company and the mission that we're on, and that's not just because I enjoy the challenge of building this company, but it's because of the goodwill we've received whenever we talk about it in an open forum. It's just amazing to see people get it right, which is, oh yeah, the ocean, got it. Oh, and sailboats. Oh yeah, that sounds cool, but actually it's the original net zero form of global transport, right? There are hieroglyphs of sailboats, So when you start to get that harness that goodwill and hear people talking back to you and going, yeah, it makes sense. Is it going to be economically viable? Good question. That's what we're aiming to prove with MVY. We think it's economically viable, and certainly economically viable in those fringes of the energy transition we talked about earlier today. I think you're right. The challenge for us is one. Right, we've demonstrated our technology at a very small scale in the UK. We've created the first ever hydrogen green hydrogen in the port of Plymouth, a very historic port, and we've done it with a vessel that foils through the water. It's like a flying boat. So we've achieved so much, but going from there to what the energy transition needs, which is grid class levels of energy, versus what we might call kettle class versus amount of energy, then that's a huge step as a company and capital intensive, but it's eminently doable. And so that's the fun part of this, is trying to get to that place where we get to that one, because it's a doable project. That's challenge one in everything we're focusing on. But challenge two is, as I mentioned earlier, it's like a wind farm, right? Building one wind turbine and going, look, it works, is hard, but that's not where you stop. The hard part is, how do you build 1,000 of them, right? Where are you going to build them? Like, where are the parts coming from? How are you going to get them into the ports? Like, how are you going to load them onto the ship? What ship's going to take them out? Who's laying the cable? There's a lot of stuff that goes into renewable energy at scale, and that's what that's our next big challenge, is how do we solve that? Now, the argument there is that shipbuilding is a thing. If you look back, our analogy goes back to the World War II and the Liberty ship example, where I think it was over 2,000 vessels were basically manufactured during that phase of the war. I think it was 2 to 3 years, 2,000 odd vessels. Like, it was a ridiculous exercise. So it is possible under, and that was back in the 1950s, that sort of era, 1945, 1950s, sort of in that zone, right, where people were literally learning how to weld for the first time. With modern technology, we think we can push through that. So that's for drift. It's about getting to one and then getting to many quickly and cheaply. That's as simple as I can put it.
Cool. Very good. The coffee is empty, and it's unfortunately time to wrap up this episode of the Circular Coffee Break. Thanks a lot, Ben. Really exciting to hear how you at Drift are addressing the energy transition, how you're contributing with one of the silver bullets to the green energy transition. And best of luck in getting to one and then getting to hundreds and thousands going forward. I will for sure be following the story and see where you're going. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. And to any of your listeners, if you're interested in learning more about how we make oceans of energy, be happy to talk. But yes, thank you so much, Michael. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with you.
Perfect. Thank you. To all the listeners out there, hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can definitely find more information about Drift also on the worldwide web sphere if you're interested, or reach out to Ben as he mentioned. If you have any ideas, suggestions, questions, as mentioned earlier, drop us a note or leave a comment on your favorite podcasting platform. Also, please remember to subscribe to stay in the loop on new episodes that will drop every 2 weeks. And there's a long list of really interesting guests from very different aspects of circularity. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you here at the Circular Coffee Break.